blind officer reaches out into the darkness, calling the name of his missing K-9 partner. The silence is unbearable. He had lost his vision, his job, and the one creature who never left his side. But what he doesn't know, his loyal companion is still searching for him, against all odds. Jake Lawson could hear the sirens, but he couldn't see the lights. The last thing he remembered was the sound of shadow barking, sharp, desperate, like he knew something Jake didn't. Then, gunfire. A searing pain tore through Jake's head, and then nothing. When he woke up, the world had changed. The doctor's words had been clinical, detached. "I'm sorry, Officer Lawson. The damage was severe. The vision loss is permanent." Permanent. The word rang in his ears, hollow and final. He was a cop, a K-9 officer. His entire life revolved around action, movement, instinct. But now he was trapped in a world of shadows. And worse, he had lost Shadow. He gripped the hospital bedsheet, his knuckles turning white. "Where's my dog?" His voice cracked, barely above a whisper. Silence. Then a cough. "Shadow has been reassigned," came the answer. It was his captain, but the words felt like a betrayal. The department decided he'd be more useful with another handler. More useful. Jake let out a breath, slow and controlled, the kind he used to take before kicking down a door. "He's my partner." "I know," his captain said, "but you're not a cop anymore." The words sliced through him sharper than the bullet that took his sight. Not a cop anymore. Jake heard footsteps fade, then the soft click of the door closing. And then, silence. His fingers twitched. His whole life he had fought to bring justice to the streets. He had taken down criminals, risked his life, built a bond with Shadow that went beyond words. And now, they expected him to just sit in the dark and let it all slip away? Number. He wasn't done, and he sure as hell wasn't letting them take Shadow from him. Jake sat on the edge of his hospital bed, gripping the cane they had given him as if it were a weapon. He hated it, hated everything about this new life they had forced on him. But nothing cut deeper than the empty space beside him where Shadow should have been. He inhaled sharply. He had to get his dog back. His fingers hovered over the phone's keypad. He still hadn't adjusted to dialing without sight, but his muscle memory carried him through. He punched in a number he knew by heart. His former partner in the force, Officer Mark Reynolds. The phone rang once, twice. Then, "Jake," Mark's voice was cautious. "You okay, man?" Jake didn't waste time. "Where's Shadow?" Mark hesitated. That was all Jake needed to hear. "They reassigned him to Officer Briggs," Mark finally admitted. "Briggs runs K-9 training now." Jake clenched his jaw. Briggs. He and the guy had never seen eye to eye, even before the accident. If Shadow was with him, it meant only one thing. The department wanted Jake to move on. "I need to see him," Jake said, his voice even. Mark sighed. "Jake, listen, man. Briggs won't allow it. The department... I don't care what the department says. Shadow is my partner." His fingers tightened around the phone. "You were there that night. You saw what happened, and you know damn well that dog doesn't belong with anyone else." Silence. Then Mark muttered, "You're not going to let this go, are you?" "No." A deep breath from the other end. "All right, I'll see what I can do. But be careful, Jake. Something's not right about any of this." Jake frowned. "What do you mean?" Mark hesitated again. "The night you were shot." "It wasn't just a bad raid. Someone tipped them off." Jake's blood ran cold. "What?" Mark lowered his voice. "I don't have proof, but I've been digging, and now they're keeping me off the case. Someone doesn't want us looking into this." Jake's grip on the phone tightened. First his sight, now his partner. Now this? "Find out whatever you can," Jake said, his voice steady, "and get me into that facility." Mark sighed again. "I'll try. But Jake, be ready for whatever you find." The line went dead. Jake sat in the silence, his mind racing. He had spent his career tracking down criminals, uncovering lies. But now he was the one caught in the dark. Shadow paced his new kennel, ears twitching at every sound. His heart pounded in frustration. He had spent years by Jake's side, his nose trained to read every emotion, his instincts sharp enough to detect danger before it happened. And now they expected him to forget. His new handler, Briggs, had tried to train him, but Shadow refused. He wasn't some tool to be reassigned. He had a job, a purpose. Jake was out there. Somewhere. And Shadow wasn't about to give up on him. As the facility quieted for the night, Shadow's ears perked. A faint sound. Footsteps. Not Briggs, not the usual guards. Someone was sneaking through the halls. And the scent. Shadow's muscles tensed. It was familiar, low, dangerous. The scent of a man who shouldn't be here. A growl rumbled in Shadow's throat. He didn't know what was happening yet, but he did know one thing. Something wasn't right. Jake sat in his darkened apartment. The only sound was the slow, steady ticking of the clock on the wall. Midnight. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't shut off his thoughts. The weight of Mark's words settled heavily in his chest. Someone tipped them off. That meant the raid hadn't been an accident. Someone wanted him blind. Someone wanted him out. And if that was true, then what else had been a lie? He clenched his fists. He had spent years trusting the Force, believing in the badge. But now he felt like an outsider, cut off, forgotten, except for Shadow. His jaw tightened. Shadow hadn't forgotten. He had no proof, but he knew in his gut that Shadow was still waiting for him, still searching. They could take away his sight, his badge, his job, but they couldn't take away what he and Shadow had built, and he sure as hell wasn't going to let them try. Shadow's body went rigid as the scent in the air grew stronger. His ears twitched. The footsteps were soft, too careful, too slow. Whoever was in the building wasn't supposed to be here. His new handler, Briggs, was asleep down the hall. The security team had done their rounds an hour ago. This was someone else. Shadow let out a low, warning growl, pressing his body against the metal bars of his cage. If someone was sneaking around, that meant danger. The footsteps paused, a shuffle, then a slow exhale. The scent was too familiar. It was the same scent that had been at the raid the night Jake was shot. Shadow's muscles coiled, his instincts screaming. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew one thing for sure. This was the enemy. Jake's phone vibrated against the table. He snatched it up. Mark's voice was tense. "Jake, there was a break-in at the K9 facility." Jake's stomach dropped. "Shadow?" "He's fine. For now." Mark hesitated. "But you won't believe what the security cameras caught." Jake swallowed hard. "Tell me." Mark's voice was low. "It wasn't just any break-in. The guy who did it. He was at the raid the night you were shot." Jake's breath caught in his throat. "You're sure?" "Positive. I checked the footage. The guy was wearing a mask, but I recognized his build. He was there." Mark paused. "And Jake? He wasn't trying to steal anything." Jake frowned. "Then what was he doing?" "He was watching the dogs, studying them." Jake's fingers curled into a fist. This wasn't random. Whoever had set him up hadn't been finished. They were still moving pieces behind the scenes. And for some reason, Shadow was a part of it. "I need to get in there," Jake said. Mark sighed. "Jake, if you show up asking questions, it's going to raise flags." "I don't care." Mark hesitated, then let out a quiet curse. "Fine. Be at the back entrance at 3 a.m. I'll get you in." Jake exhaled, gripping the phone tightly. "Thanks, Mark." A beat of silence. Then Mark muttered, "I hope you know what you're walking into." Jake didn't. But he didn't care. The facility was silent when Mark let Jake in. The air smelled of concrete, disinfectant, and faint traces of fur. Jake walked slowly, his cane tapping against the cold floor. He didn't need his eyes to know where he was. He could feel it. The rows of kennels stretched out to his left and right. And then, a sound, a sharp intake of breath, a shift of movement. Jake's heart pounded. He wasn't alone. Who's there? Silence. Then, a soft whimper. Jake's breath caught. He didn't need sight to recognize that sound. Shadow. His cane hit the metal bars, and suddenly Shadow was moving, pressing against the gate, whining, desperate. Jake swallowed hard. He reached forward, feeling for the latch. "Don't move." Jake froze. The voice was low, unfamiliar, but the barrel of a gun pressing against his rib cage, that was all too familiar. "Step away from the cage," the voice ordered. Jake clenched his jaw. "Who are you?" A scoff. "That's not important." Jake's pulse pounded. Someone didn't want him here. Someone was willing to stop him. Permanently. Shadow let out a deep, guttural growl. Jake could hear the tension in his body, the way his paws scraped against the concrete. "Your dog seems pissed," the man sneered. "Guess he knows when his owner's in trouble." Jake inhaled slowly. He wasn't walking out of here without a fight, and neither was this guy. The second the man shifted his grip on the gun, Jake moved. He slammed his cane against the man's wrist, knocking the weapon loose. The gun clattered to the ground, and the man let out a grunt of surprise. Shadow erupted into action. The metal latch of the cage snapped under the weight of his body, and before the intruder could recover, Shadow lunged. A scream. A struggle. Jake heard a body hit the floor. Then silence. Jake's breathing was ragged. Shadow? A warm nose pressed into his palm. Jake exhaled, gripping the thick fur, grounding himself. He wasn't alone anymore. Footsteps pounded toward them. Mark's voice urgent. "Jake, what the hell happened?" Jake forced himself to stand. There was a guy. He had a gun. Mark cursed. "Where is he?" Jake frowned. He crouched down, reaching. Nothing. The guy was gone. Jake's jaw clenched. Whoever this was, he wasn't working alone. Mark exhaled sharply. "We need to get out of here before someone else shows up." Jake didn't argue. He reached down, gripping Shadow's harness. For the first time since the accident, he felt whole again. But this wasn't over. Not even close. Whoever had set him up was still out there. And now they had a reason to be afraid. The air outside was sharp and cold as Jake stepped out of the facility, Shadow moving in sync beside him. The moment his fingers curled around the dog's harness, it was as if nothing had changed. Except everything had. Mark led them toward his car, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds. His nerves were obvious. "We need to get out of here before the department finds out you were inside." Jake's grip tightened on Shadow. "That guy wasn't some random intruder. He was connected to my shooting." Mark exhaled. "I know." Jake stiffened. "What do you mean?" Mark opened the car door for him. "Get in. I'll tell you everything." Jake hesitated before sliding into the passenger seat. Shadow followed without needing to be told, settling at his feet. The car door shut, and Mark took off, speeding down the empty street. After a moment, Mark spoke, his voice low. "I've been digging into your case, and the more I look, the worse it gets. The department closed the investigation fast. Too fast." Jake frowned. "They called it a gang ambush." Mark let out a bitter chuckle. "Yeah, that's what they wanted everyone to believe. But there's something off. The guy at the K9 unit tonight? He's not just some low-level criminal. I checked the footage before I got to you. He used an old police tactic to move through the building." Jake's pulse pounded. "You're saying he was a cop?" Mark hesitated. "Or he used to be." Jake inhaled slowly. This was deeper than he'd thought. Someone had set him up. Someone on the inside. And if that was true, then the person who stole his sight was still walking free. The car pulled up outside Jake's apartment. Mark killed the engine but didn't move. "I'm going to keep looking into this, but you need to lay low." Jake turned his head toward him. "You know I won't." Mark sighed. "Yeah, I figured." Jake reached down, running a hand over Shadow's fur. His heart hammered. If there was a dirty cop behind this, then Shadow was a target too. The intruder at the facility wasn't there to steal anything. He was there for Shadow, which meant one thing. Shadow knew something. Mark drove off, leaving Jake and Shadow in the quiet. Jake unlocked his door, stepping inside, his fingers grazing the familiar furniture. Everything felt the same, but inside, he was different. Shadow padded forward, sniffing the air. His body was tense, alert. Jake froze. Something wasn't right. He reached for the gun he kept in the drawer by the door. His fingers curled around the cold metal. He clicked the safety off, keeping his stance steady. "Whoever's here," he called out, "I suggest you speak now before my dog rips you apart." Silence. Then, a soft laugh. Jake's grip tightened. The laugh was smooth, almost amused. "You've still got that fire, Lawson." Jake's breath caught. He knew that voice. A memory clawed its way to the surface. Years ago, before everything went wrong. Late nights in the precinct, cases cracked over cold coffee and exhaustion. A friend. A brother. Detective Hale. The name tasted bitter now. Shadow growled low, sensing the tension. Hale let out a sigh. "I should have known you wouldn't just let this go." Jake kept his stance firm. "You were at the raid." A pause. Then, "Yes." Jake clenched his jaw. "Did you set me up?" Another pause. Hale exhaled. "It's not that simple." Jake's voice turned sharp. "Then explain it to me." Hale shifted. "I didn't know you were going to get hurt. I was following orders." Jake's stomach twisted. "Orders?" Hale hesitated. There was a deal being made that night, one that was supposed to happen quietly. But then your team showed up. Jake's blood ran cold. "You're telling me someone in the department was working with the gang?" Hale didn't answer. That was answer enough. Jake gritted his teeth. "Who?" Hale hesitated. "Jake, you don't understand." "Who?" Silence. Then, Hale's voice dropped to a whisper. "Captain Briggs." Jake's entire body went rigid. Briggs, the man who took Shadow from him, the man who fought to keep him out of the force, the man who had control over the entire K-9 unit. A pit formed in Jake's stomach. Briggs hadn't just taken Shadow because he thought Jake was useless. He had taken Shadow because Shadow was a witness. Hale let out a shaky breath. "You don't get it, Jake. You need to leave this alone." Jake shook his head. "That's not happening." Hale's voice turned desperate. "You think you're going to get justice? The second Briggs knows you're poking around, you're a dead man." Jake didn't flinch. "Then I better move fast." Hale cursed under his breath. "I never should have come here." A shift in weight, a flicker of movement. Then, the sound of a gun being drawn. Jake reacted instantly. Shadow lunged. A grunt, a struggle, a crash. Jake swung his gun toward the sound, but before he could fire, a door slammed open, then shut. Silence. Jake exhaled, his pulse pounding. Hale was gone. Shadow padded back to Jake's side, his breathing heavy. Jake reached down, gripping his fur, grounding himself. Briggs. This wasn't just a mistake. Briggs had been pulling strings for years, keeping his hands clean, eliminating threats. And Jake? Jake had been blind to it. He felt the weight of his gun in his hand. Not anymore. Hale had been right about one thing. Jake didn't have much time. Briggs would know soon enough that Jake was digging, which meant one thing: Briggs was coming for him. Jake straightened. His heart pounded, but his mind was clear. He wasn't a cop anymore, but he was still a fighter. He reached down, gripping Shadow's harness. "Come on, boy." His voice was calm, steady. "It's time to finish this." Jake sat in the dim light of his apartment, his mind racing. Shadow lay at his feet, ears twitching at every small sound. There was no more doubt. Briggs was behind it all. His blindness, the setup, the raid that wasn't supposed to happen. Jake exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of his gun in his hand. He had spent years enforcing the law, believing in the system. Now, the system had turned on him, and if he didn't move fast, he'd be dead before the sun came up. Shadow's ears perked, his head snapping toward the door. A low growl rumbled in his throat. Jake stilled. Someone was outside. He reached for his phone, his fingers finding Mark's number. He pressed call. 1 ring, 2, then, "Jake?" Mark's voice was tense. "I need to know something," Jake said quietly, his voice controlled. "Briggs, how deep does this go?" Mark hesitated. "Jake, listen." "Don't stall me," Jake snapped. "I don't have time." A pause, then Mark exhaled. "Briggs has been dirty for years. We just never had proof. Money laundering, deals with known criminals, covering for corrupt officers. But nobody could touch him. He's too well connected." Jake's jaw tightened. So Briggs wasn't just another dirty cop. He was running the whole damn operation. Jake kept his voice calm. "And my shooting?" Mark sighed. "That raid was never supposed to happen, Jake. Your team was sent in blind, because you weren't supposed to walk out." Jake's grip on the phone tightened. He already knew the answer, but he needed to hear it. "Did Briggs order it?" Another pause. Then, "Yes." The confirmation sent a slow, burning rage through Jake's veins. Briggs had tried to kill him, and he had almost succeeded. Mark lowered his voice. "Jake, I don't know what you're planning, but you need to let me handle this." Jake exhaled. "It's too late for that." A soft click echoed in the room. The front door. Someone was picking the lock. Jake moved fast, shoving the phone into his pocket. He stepped back, pressing his back against the wall. Shadow was already alert, muscles tensed. A second later, the door creaked open. Footsteps. Slow. Careful. Jake counted the seconds, listening. 1 person, maybe 2, armed. He inhaled quietly, gripping his gun. They were here to finish the job. The footsteps moved closer. Jake tightened his grip on the gun, waiting. A faint rustle of fabric, the sound of a suppressed breath. Then, a whisper. "Kill him quick." Jake didn't wait. He fired. A sharp cry of pain. A body hit the floor. Chaos erupted. A second attacker lunged, but Shadow was faster. He tore forward, a snarl ripping through the room. The man barely had time to react before Shadow's jaws clamped down on his arm. A scream. A struggle. Jake moved, shifting toward the fight. His hands moved on instinct, his training kicking in. He didn't need sight to fight. He just needed to listen. The attacker yanked free from Shadow's grip, stumbling back. A gun cocked. Jake pivoted and fired again. Another body dropped. Then silence. Jake stood still, his breath controlled. The smell of gunpowder filled the room. Shadow panted beside him, his body still tense, waiting. Then, movement. One of the men was still alive. Jake stepped forward, pressing his foot down on the man's chest. "Who sent you?" A ragged cough. The man tried to move, but Jake pressed harder. "Talk!" A wheezing breath. Then, "Briggs. Nose." Jake's blood turned to ice. The man coughed again, blood bubbling from his lips. He wouldn't last much longer. Jake leaned in. "Where is he?" The man let out a weak chuckle. He's waiting for you." Then his breath hitched. His body went still. Jake exhaled slowly, stepping back. Briggs was making his move, and that meant one thing. Jake had to make his first. Jake didn't go to Mark. He didn't go to the police. This was his fight. He moved carefully, gathering what little he had left, his gun, a few spare rounds, and a plan. Briggs wanted him dead? Fine. Then Jake would make sure Briggs never saw him coming. Briggs' private warehouse sat on the edge of town, isolated. The perfect place to do business that the department didn't need to know about. Jake moved in silence, Shadow at his side. He couldn't see the shadows stretching across the lot, but he could hear them. Guards. 5, maybe 6. Didn't matter. He wasn't here for them. He was here for Briggs. Jake crouched low, his fingers running over Shadow's fur. Find him. Shadow didn't hesitate. He moved fast, weaving through the darkness. Jake followed. Minutes stretched into eternity. Then, voices. Jake pressed against the cold metal of a shipping container, listening. Briggs was close. "Should have killed him at the hospital," Briggs was saying, his voice sharp with frustration. "He's a blind man with a damn dog. How hard can this be?" Jake's grip on his gun tightened. Another voice. "We sent 2 men." Briggs scoffed. And clearly they failed. A pause. Then a sigh. "Fine. I'll deal with him myself." Jake's heart pounded. That was all he needed to hear. He stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. Briggs turned, and for the first time, Jake wished he could see the look on his face. "Lawson." Jake's voice was calm, steady. "Didn't think I'd make it, did you?" A slow chuckle. "You should have stayed down, kid." Jake shook his head. "You should have killed me when you had the chance." A pause. Then Briggs moved, the sound of a gun being drawn. But Jake was faster. He fired. Briggs let out a choked sound, stumbling back. Jake stepped forward, his aim still steady. That was for Shadow. Another shot. Briggs collapsed. Jake exhaled, his body trembling. It was over. The sirens wailed in the distance. Mark had called it in. Briggs' empire was finished. Jake stood in the chaos, Shadow sitting at his side. He had lost his sight. He had lost his badge. But he hadn't lost himself. Shadow nudged his hand, and Jake smiled faintly. "Yeah, boy, we did it." The fight was over. But justice had just begun. The warehouse burned behind him, sirens flashing in the distance. Jake stood still, listening to the chaos. His job was done. Briggs was dead. His empire had crumbled. The corruption that nearly destroyed Jake had been wiped out in one final bullet. But the emptiness inside him remained. Shadow nudged his hand, warm fur grounding him back to reality. He reached down, running his fingers through the dog's coat, the only thing that had stayed constant through all of it. Mark's car screeched to a halt nearby. He rushed out, breathless. "Jesus, Jake, are you okay?" Jake nodded, his expression unreadable. "It's over." Mark exhaled, glancing at the burning warehouse. "The department's gonna bury this. They'll never admit how deep it went." Jake expected that. Justice wasn't about headlines. It wasn't about the department saving face. It was about making sure people like Briggs never had the power to destroy lives again. A police radio crackled inside Mark's car. Officers were approaching fast. Jake turned to him. "They'll want to question me." Mark rubbed his face. "They won't be friendly." Jake didn't care. He had nothing left to hide. He had already lost everything once. This time, he was walking away on his own terms. Mark hesitated before opening the passenger door. "You need a ride?" Jake gave Shadow's harness a light tug. "I'll walk." Mark didn't argue. He just nodded. "Take care of yourself, Jake." Jake didn't answer. He just turned and walked into the darkness. The city streets were quieter than usual. Night had settled in, casting long shadows across the pavement. Shadow moved beside him, perfectly in sync. Jake didn't need his eyes to know where he was going. He wasn't going back to his apartment. He wasn't going back to the life he had before. That life was gone. Instead, he headed toward the only place that made sense. An old building, abandoned for years, just outside the city limits. It used to be a community center before funding dried up. Now it was empty, forgotten. But Jake had different plans for it. He pushed the door open. Dust filled his lungs, but he didn't care. He let go of Shadow's harness and moved forward, feeling the space. Plenty of room, enough to build something new. A place where K-9 officers could train. A place where retired police dogs wouldn't be discarded like old equipment. A place for people like him. Those the system had turned its back on. Shadow sat at his feet, waiting. Jake crouched down, scratching behind his ears. "What do you think, boy?" Shadow huffed, his tail thumping against the floor. Jake smiled for the first time in a long time. He wasn't a cop anymore, but that didn't mean he was done fighting. This was just the beginning. Morning light streamed through the broken windows of the abandoned building. Dust particles floated in the air, but to Jake it didn't matter. He could feel the space. He could hear the potential in the silence. This wasn't just an empty shell. It was the start of something real. Shadow lay beside him, his breathing steady. The dog had been through hell and back, just like Jake, but they were still standing, still fighting. The city had moved on from the chaos of last night. The department had already begun sweeping Briggs' crimes under the rug, trying to erase the scandal. But some wounds don't disappear just because the news stops talking about them. Mark had called an hour ago. "They're ruling it self-defense. You won't face charges, but they want you gone, Jake. No more digging, no more questions." Jake had laughed. He wasn't planning on stopping. Briggs had been one problem, but corruption didn't die with one man. There were more like him. People who bent the law for their own gain, who used good cops like disposable tools and discarded them when they got in the way. Jake had been blind to it for years. Now? Now he saw everything clearly. A knock echoed from the doorway. Jake didn't turn. He didn't need to. Mark stepped inside, footsteps cautious. "You really gonna do this?" Jake ran his fingers along Shadow's harness, feeling the worn leather. "Yeah." Mark sighed. "You could take some time off, man. Let it go." Jake shook his head. "Can't." Mark leaned against the doorway. "So, what's the plan?" Jake took a deep breath. "This place is going to be a home for the ones they forget. Retired K-9S officers who lost their way. People like me." Mark was quiet for a long time. Then he muttered, "You know, if you need help." Jake smirked. "You volunteering?" Mark chuckled. "I've seen what happens when I leave you alone too long. Somebody always ends up dead." Jake exhaled through his nose. "I don't want revenge, Mark. I want something better. I want to make sure the next guy doesn't end up like me." Mark nodded slowly. "Then I guess you're going to need funding, contacts, permits, and I just might know a guy." Jake tilted his head, listening. "Tell me more." A week passed, then another. The building was cleaned out, slowly coming back to life. Mark pulled in favors. Old friends came around. Donations started trickling in. Some retired K-9 officers reached out, asking how they could help. Word spread. Jake wasn't just another forgotten cop. He was building something. And Shadow? Shadow was right there, watching over it all, the way he always had. Jake still had enemies. He knew that. There were still people out there who didn't want him digging deeper, who wanted to keep their secrets buried. But they made one mistake. They thought taking his sight would stop him. They thought taking his badge would break him. They thought he was finished. They were wrong. Because some battles don't end when you lose. Some wars don't stop just because one fight is over. Jake had lost a lot, but he had found something bigger. and he wasn't going anywhere. Shadow let out a soft huff, pressing his nose into Jake's hand. Jake smiled. Yeah, boy, we're just getting started. Some battles don't end with a badge. Some heroes don't need sight to see the truth. If you believe in justice, loyalty, and never backing down, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that keep you on the edge. And if you're ready for the next mind-blowing story, don't stop here. Watch the next video now.